As you watch the screen, your heart begins to beat faster. There's a fluttering in the pit of your stomach. Suddenly a chill runs down your spine. You tell yourself, it's only a movie. But sooner or later, it's time to go home.
Hey podcast listeners, here we are, the second episode for August 2015, episode 72 of the Bangers in Mash Show. Isn't that right, Mr. Mash?
That is correct.
Today we have a different sort of episode. The Bangers in Mash Show is getting philosophical. We're asking one singular question. Well, actually we're asking a couple of questions, but the most important one, the one that's going to be the title of this episode is...
What is horror?
What is horror? What is it?
You know, it's that stuff you're afraid of that they make into movies.
Or books, even. Anybody who's been into the horror fandom, as long as we have, you've been pretty much in it your whole life, and I've been in it most of my whole life at this point.
That's right. I'm the true horror aficionado in this group.
It depends on how you define aficionado.
But I've been a fan of the horror genre my whole life. I was raised on it. That's what I watched instead of Saturday morning cartoons.
You watch Saturday morning cartoons, too, though.
Well, that's true, I did. I saw The Exorcist when I was 3. I got straight up horror cred.
I think anybody who's been in the genre as long as we have eventually has to ask the questions of, why does this appeal to us so much? Why are we so drawn to it? Before we answer those questions, we have to answer the question of what even is horror? You and I don't even seem to agree on what horror is half the time, and I'm sure it's that way for a lot of people.
You and I disagree on whether or not Alien is horror or sci-fi.
It's both. Alien is both horror and sci-fi, but I think it's primarily horror since it's basically an old dark house movie.
I think it's primarily sci-fi. Aliens in space.
When I ask you the question up front, what is horror? What would be your answer?
Something that scares me. And I don't mean the jump scares and the springboard cat. That don't scare anybody.
There is an art to the jump scare, and some films have done it extremely well, but usually it's super, super cheap. The cheapest kind of scare.
Right. I prefer movies that build up to the jump scare but never deliver, like It Follows.
If some crazy person came to me on the street and said, what is horror? I would say horror is anything that's designed to horrify or repulse, create fear or tension. Good answer?
Well, yeah, but that's too textbooky. Halloween.
Okay.
That movie invented a few of the horror conventions. You know, got your slasher that stalks. He doesn't jump out every 5 minutes. They create the dread of the moment. You constantly see Michael actually stalking Laurie, which really adds to the suspense.
And I like that you mentioned the word dread. Something I've written down here. No less of an authority on the genre than Stephen King has said that there's 4 different types of scares. Dread, fear, creepiness, and the gross out. I don't always agree with everything that Stephen King says. I know when he was talking about the Carrie remake, he wanted Lindsay Lohan to play Carrie because Stephen King did a lot of cocaine in the 80s. But there is some truth to that. There is a difference between those 4 emotions. The gross out, I think we would agree, is the easiest of those 4 things.
Oh yeah, like Evil Dead.
The first 2 Evil Dead movies play a lot on the gross out.
Even the remake.
Definitely, when the one limb is dangling by a fiber.
There's the torture porn.
I object to the term torture porn. I find it to be overly sensationalistic, mostly because there's stuff out there that really is literally torture porn. Whatever people jerk off to is their business. I prefer torture horror. And I'm not immediately down on the torture genre. When the first 2 Saw movies came out, I was a pretty big fan of those movies.
Yeah, but it got old quick.
I enjoyed the first 4 Saw movies. I said it. After that, the franchise lost its novelty. When Saw first came out, I thought of Saw as an evolution of what the Dr. Phibes films did in the 70s. Those movies had a very different tone than Saw. Those films are campy, Saw's very grim. But they're both about novelty of the ridiculous death scene. The Omen films and then the Final Destination series, which draws a lot from the Omen series, is about something similar. There are some fantastic films made in what you would call the torture genre. Just the other night, I was reading about how they've done an American remake of Martyrs or Martyrs, which I have absolutely no idea how they're going to sell Martyrs to Middle America, because that's one of the most brutal, punishing horror films I've ever seen. But what's so fascinating about Martyrs is that it's not out of shock value. The film is attempting to say something and speak to something. The American remake of that is something I'm definitely dreading, that I can't imagine. Anyway, but even the Human Centipede movies, I appreciate those films on a certain level, but there's no doubt that the Human Centipede franchise, if you can even call it a franchise, is the face of the modern gross-out horror movie.
That's fair. Again, I don't really go for the gross. Tell me you're going to watch a horror movie, I'll sit down and watch it with you. I don't give a shit.
Even if it's Sharknado 3?
Ooh.
Most every horror fan goes through a gore phase where they're really into the goriness of the special effects. We can appreciate a good gore scene as much as anybody else. Listen to the fucking show.
Right. There's a difference between tasteful gore and just throwing it for the gross out.
I don't even know if tasteful is the right word for it. A movie that I love, The Burning or The Prowler or Sleepaway Camp 2, I don't know if you could call those tasteful. There is a certain art to the gross out, and any movie that is 90 minutes of pure gross out is going to lose its novelty very quickly.
Right.
It's easy to think of examples of quote-unquote gross-out movies that work really well, like the first Evil Dead. Now, that
Yes.
movie's operating on other levels.
Right. Sam Raimi has a way of delivering the gore.
Presentation and the shooting, the direction in that film is incredible.
The famous tree rape scene.
Yeah, it's hard to defend the tree rape, especially in today's environment that's very sensitive about that kind of thing.
Get over, guys, it's in a movie, I'm sorry. One of the most terrifying scenes in that movie.
But what would you define as some of the other scares we talked about, like dread, fear, creepiness? Creepiness is a distinct thing. There are movies that give you a nice, chilly, creepy feeling. It doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't become frightening or really intense. There's such a thing as a fun creepiness. The Phantasm series does a good job, especially that first one. That movie has nice, eerie creepiness to it. I don't know if it goes any further than that on the scare scale, and that's, of course, a matter of opinion. That is comfort horror film. A lot of the movies from the 30s and 40s give me that pleasantly...
I was getting ready to say, almost any classic Universal monster movie.
Yeah, but I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, I was not having a good year. I put on House of Horror with Rondo Hakan. That just been released on DVD for the first time. And that film has such a nice, spooky feeling to it. And the original Mummy, weirdly, is one that gives me that feeling too. That creakiness. It's a comforting kind of creepiness, which I guess is a weird thing to think about.
Well, no, and it gets you nostalgic.
Nostalgia is a big part of horror.
Dracula, I feel like, would be my definition of the movie that is creepy but never really gets more than that.
Oh, I would agree. I think the early scenes of Dracula in the catacombs
are
very
eyes,
creepy. Yeah.
It's just creepy. Those movies aren't terrifying or scary, but they're creepy.
It's so hard to quantify what's scary versus creepy versus frightening. It's completely personal.
Those movies you could show to a 5-year-old and it might not give them nightmares.
It depends on the 5-year-old.
Where Dracula compared to Nightmare on Elm Street.
Where does the original Nightmare on Elm Street fall on the dread, fear, creepiness, gross out scale?
That'd be a mix between fear and gross out.
Great horror film should ideally give you all 4 of these feelings.
Kind of does deliver on all 4.
The Exorcist definitely creates fantastic dread, and it creates very frightening sequences, but there's also a big degree of gross out. But then again, there's something like The Shining, which is one of the scariest films ever made, and that movie functions entirely on dread. When I hear dread, that's what I think. Dreadful scenario is a nightmare. Think about nightmares you have had, where you're just stuck in a very unpleasant situation that makes you very upset. The scariest nightmares to me are the ones that just seem like something bad is going to happen.
A lot of my nightmares involve zombies. It involves me getting surrounded or chased by large quantities of zombies.
Have you ever had the slow motion running nightmare, where something's chasing you, but you can't get away, you're running in slow motion?
No. I've had the dream where you run from place to place, but whatever's chasing you always seems to... I don't like It Follows.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
I think that's why It Follows scared me so bad. I've always had dreams where the zombie hordes gotta be running and I'd get to a safe place, and then they're doing the zombie movies, they break in.
Always there. I remember one nightmare that had a really big effect on me. There are a lot of nightmares that have had effects on me over my life, but one I really remember, this was a recurring nightmare I would have at Christmas time. Part of this is weird, is that I was being chased up the stairs in my house by...
It was the Krampus. It was coming to get
No. It's even stupider than that. I was being chased by the Puppet Master puppets. Those movies don't scare me. They've never scared me. But yes, they got to me on some level. I would have nightmares about I couldn't get up my steps chased by blades and tunneler, which is a really weird thing to have a nightmare about, but that's one that really sticks in my mind.
The one reoccurring zombie dream that I have, I'm in this old-timey lakeside log cabin. It's almost very similar to The Town in the fall. I keep running from all these zombies, but these zombies, they've got boils on their faces. My girlfriend in the dream, because I have a girlfriend in the dream.
Because it's a dream.
And at one point in time, her head gets thrown in my lap.
This dream sounds like it would make an awesome movie.
I've had it 3 times in my life.
Weird.
Wake up in sweats from this nightmare.
That's a really specific thing. Speaking of waking up in a cold sweat, I had a nightmare once. I was still living with my dad at the time, and I dreamt about hell. I had a nightmare about hell. Fire and brimstone and demons and torture. And
that's because you're at your dad's house.
Yeah, probably. So anyway, let's talk a little bit more about like what we define as a horror film. A film you and I have discussed over and over again about, is this a horror movie? Is Black Swan. I consider Black Swan a horror movie.
It's not a horror movie. It's a psychological thriller.
This is the argument we've had.
It's not even a thriller. It's more of a drama.
How do you define horror versus psychological thriller then?
The reason that I say Black Swan is not a horror movie, it's a psychological drama or character study or whatever you want to call it. All the horrifying stuff that happens in the movie is all in her head.
But there are some people, some experts on the genre, who define insanity as a horror element.
But her insanity does not affect the outside world.
Losing your mind is one of the scariest things I can think of happening.
I understand where you're coming from. That movie is not a horror movie.
But what about the elements of body horror in Black Swan? There's all sorts of body horror. When she pulls the skin off her fingernails.
But it's all in her head. You can't say, okay, well, this movie has special effects, so it's a horror movie. In that case, 99% of the movies that come out every year are horror movies.
Well, I don't say that. Agree to disagree on
this
this
one. If you
one.
want to have that argument, then any movie about a kid going through puberty is a body horror movie.
It kind of is!
So therefore, it's a horror movie.
Something I was thinking about. People say the original Hunchback of Notre Dame with Lon Chaney, that's classified as a horror film. But it's not. It's a gothic melodrama. All that classic horror stuff, Frankenstein and Dracula, Phantom of the Opera, all these stories have elements of the gothic melodrama in it, to the point where it's hard to distinguish what's horror versus gothic melodrama. In a gothic melodrama, common occurrences are people losing their minds, the concept of the grotesque, somebody who's deformed, either through birth or through some sort of mutilation. Haunted houses and insanity. These are all elements of the gothic melodrama.
Okay, but in that movie, Quasimodo is physically deformed.
Yeah, he's born...
And is an element of body horror.
Okay, that's fair.
So basically, he's the monster of the movie, and he kills people.
Well, in defense.
It doesn't matter, he kills people.
So what you're saying is if you've got any movie that has a physically deformed person who's killing somebody, even if he's the hero of the film, like in Hunchback, is a horror film.
See, now you're trying to switch that shit around on me.
What about the term thriller? What's the difference between a horror movie and a thriller? Is there a difference? Because sometimes I'm not sure there is.
You know, that is a good question. I think a thriller has more action elements to it. While there is a main antagonist that might be doing his thing like in Cape Fear.
Cape Fear, I think, lies
is
on...
a thriller.
Yeah, on the thriller side of that divide. When Silence of the Lamb came out, it was sold as a thriller. That's a fucking horror movie. People are getting their faces cut off, strung up by their intestines. Silence of the Lambs is a horror movie.
I think a thriller is a movie that may even have slasher elements, but...
Dressed to Kill, for one.
For me, I think Single White Female is a thriller.
It doesn't quite get gruesome enough to cross into horror, though. It's debatable. It's really debatable. Where does Seven lie on the horror versus thriller
I think
spectrum?
that's more horror. I mean, there's a head in the box.
It has the thriller outline. You're following the cops. There's an element of mystery and investigation of that movie. It doesn't play by the rules of the mystery genre. The murder scenes in that movie are so grotesque that it pushes it into horror.
In my opinion, the difference between thrillers and horror movies is, in horror movies, you may care about the victims, but we're really rooting for the bad guy.
But then again, it depends on the type of horror movie you're watching.
Well, true. I think slasher movies, because slasher movies are really the closest thing in horror to a thriller.
That goes back to the Italian giallo, which is hard to define between thriller and horror sometimes. What defines a giallo? There's always an element of an investigation. Some giallos are very hard on the horror, but more giallos, some of the early stuff from Mario Bava, is more mysterious. The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which is regarded as the first giallo, has very little horror elements. The difference should be there in the name. A horror movie horrifies, a thriller thrills. But it's so hard to define what's horrific and what's thrilling.
Right, they use thrills, chills, stuff like that to advertise the universal horror movie.
Yeah, it's the difference between a thriller and a horror film is on a film-to-film basis. Something that's on my shelf over here, one of the things I own, I don't know why. Murder by Numbers, a Sandra Bullock movie. That's a thriller. Elsewhere on my shelf, and you pull off Dressed to Kill by Brian De Palma. That's a horror film.
So Hand That Rocks the Cradle.
Thriller.
Why is it a thriller? Even though she kills people, she also manipulates.
The desired effect on the audience is different. Horror movies are allowed to be more hopeless, why thrillers usually have to have some sort of moral centitude.
You know what the real difference between thrillers and horror movies is?
What?
The budget.
Yeah, thrillers are glossier. They're more expensive. They're studio movies.
If you want my true opinion on it, I would just say the thriller is more of a subgenre of horror.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness some scenes from the next attraction to play this theater. This picture, truly one of the most unusual ever filmed, contains scenes which under no circumstances should be viewed by anyone with a heart condition or anyone who is easily upset. We urgently recommend that if you are such a person or the parent of a young or impressionable child now in attendance, that you and the child leave the auditorium
Let's move on to our next question here. Why does horror appeal to us? Let's get a little personal here on tonight's Bangers and Match episode.
The reason horror appeals to me is because I might sound a little crazy.
It's the internet, it's okay.
Everybody has that moment in their life where, God, I want to kick that person so bad. Or you want to stab them in the back just one time, let them know how it feels.
If we're being completely honest, every human being has had a
one moment where man, I'd like to kill that motherfucker.
I just want to strangle the hell out of him. Everybody has that limit.
Horror movies allow us to explore that without actually having to deal with it. For example, Halloween, where it gives us a lot of the first-person views.
A lot of horror likes to play with the element of voyeurism in every movie. A lot of that goes back to two movies made in the 60s. Basically the entire career of Alfred Hitchcock, because so many of his movies deal with themes about voyeurism. And then a British film called Peeping Tom, which is all about it. And a lot of movies like to play with that. There is this balance in the appeal of every horror fan. On one level, we do relate to the victims, because everybody's felt frightened or powerless in their life. And that's one of the base appeals of horror. Maybe the difference between somebody who casually enjoys horror films and the die-hard horror fans like us is the degree to which you vicariously enjoy the antics of the monster or the killer or whatever the film's about. The slasher genre is built upon vicarious thrills because we sympathize with Freddy and Jason. We like them. They're charismatic, interesting, entertaining characters.
Yeah, two of those characters don't even speak.
That goes back to the monster movies of the 30s. I saw Frankenstein last night. Frankenstein was on Turner Classic Movies. They were having a May Clark night. Every time I watch it, the degree to which the monster's plight speaks to me. That was intentional. The horror genre has always walked that line between you're supposed to be afraid of the monster and you're supposed to sympathize with the monster. Hard line to follow, and some movies abandon it entirely. But why does horror appeal to me? You hear people say this all the time. I want to approach my fears in a safe environment. Have you heard that?
Yeah, but that's bullshit.
Isn't it? I've always thought it was bullshit.
For every fear that someone has, there's another person out there that has that same exact fear. The true masters of horror, Clive Barker, John Carpenter, they know how to take one element that could scare someone to their core and then push it even further. Let's use the Cenobites, for instance. The 80s was a time where there was a lot more knowledge of homosexuality.
Yeah, homosexuality was coming into the mainstream.
Things that were considered sexual deviancies at the time were things that people were afraid of. Clive Barker, being the master of horror that he is,
and a gay man,
made the Cenobites, which are S&M, the movie.
Yeah, it's also notable in that original Hellraiser, the Cenobites aren't really the bad guys.
No, they're not.
I read a very compelling article recently that made the case that the original Hellraiser was a parable about the AIDS epidemic, about sexual desire destroying people. Very interesting way to look at it.
The Cenobites, they talk about how pain and pleasure are the same thing.
Angels to some, demons to others.
That movie scared people.
Let's say the more successful horror films have an element of a roller coaster ride where what happens? You get on a roller coaster, you get a real thrill because you're going fast and around corners and everything, and it's exciting, but then it's over in a few seconds. Something people don't remember is that the roller coaster, it doesn't take a lot screw to come loose and the whole thing to go careening and everybody dies horribly, though it doesn't really happen that often anymore.
That's the difference between thriller and a horror. No. In the 70s.
Yeah.
With The Exorcist.
Yeah.
People were afraid of losing their religion. Then that movie came out and scared people back to church.
Because The Exorcist really came at a point where the culture was changing, or had already changed. The religious moral center that was so important in, say, the 50s, it was starting to shift. Our values as a culture were changing. The Exorcist smartly talked about it. But I've never really bought the exploring our fears in a safe environment excuse, because it's a cop-out. That lets the audience off the hook. When you're watching a horror movie, the best ones play on that dynamic. You're rooting for Jason's victims to survive. At the same time, you're rooting for Jason to kill everybody. What's the cliche of the horror fan? Probably a beard, male, usually, black t-shirt, listens to heavy metal, social outcast.
Now, hold on now. There are plenty of female horror fans.
There are, but what's the cultural stereotype of horror fan?
Well, I guess the rockabilly.
Every once in a while, you'll see it on one of these forensic shows on CSI or NCIS. They always describe the character as some nutjob who's into murders or horror or heavy metal. Can't believe that stereotype still exists in 2015, but it does. It's getting better. That's part of the reasons why the hardcore horror fan has been considered an outcast. This concept in our society that it's not normal to be interested in death and murder and darkness. And I think most anybody who loves horror would agree that it's one of the most human things to be interested in death. It's going to happen to you, and it's going to happen to everybody you know.
Right. Talking about the horror fan stereotype, one of the things that I liked about Scream, the whole cast, with the exception of Sydney, were horror fans. They just looked like normal kids. So shifted a
and I
little
think
bit.
that was one of the reasons why Scream was so popular and led to a mini revival of interest in the slasher genre, which we'll be talking about soon. Why do we like grotesque, horrific images and ideas? That's the basis of the horror genre, as we've already defined. Why do we like it?
Every once in a while, I'll find that new thing that scares me that I didn't know scared me. To me, that's the appeal. Finding that new thing that scares you. For instance, thanks to Day of the Dead and VHS and that thing on the internet, hands coming out of walls. Not a fan.
Discovered a new phobia.
The hand coming out of the wall, especially Day of the Dead. Did you hear that?
Yeah, the opening sequence where she's in the bunker. Getting back to VHS and that creepy internet video, we'll have to link it in the YouTube description. I'm sure most everybody's seen it at this point. But when the hands ghost out of the wall, there's that weird noise, that noise, somewhere between a moan and a metallic bending. Sound design, I think, is the most underrated aspect of all movie making, but of horror specifically.
The bad sound design can ruin a good movie.
Absolutely. To ask myself the question of why does the grotesque and the horrific appeal to me, it's a hard thing to really root out. I think that, I'll go back to this, I had such intense, horrible nightmares as a kid that rooted me in that world. Maybe I am being a hypocrite when you watch horror, when you're like me and you write horror too. Maybe there is a degree of exploring not just your own fears, but your own insecurities, things about your own personality that make you uncomfortable.
But to straight up say that allows you to explore your fears...
It's more complicated than that.
I think it's more along the lines of for people who write horror. That allows them to explore their sadistic tendencies.
And I know there are people who work in horror and write who deny outright, saying like, there's nothing sadistic about what I write. And I don't know if that's true.
Oh, come on.
I really don't buy that.
I'm sure Rob Zombie never had any sadistic tendencies when he wrote House of a Thousand Corpses.
There is an element of sadism in horror that...
It's just part of it. We're not trying to perverse it or anything like that.
You go back to Edgar Allan Poe, he would talk about perversity as this thing that needs to be explored. When I say perversity, I don't mean sex pervert. I mean this need to transgress against societal niceties, whatever those may be. That is an essential part of the human psyche. Man, this is getting deep.
Well, you know, and then like,
and let's not beat around the bush. I mentioned death. The entire horror genre is built around confronting the inevitability of death.
We need to have more Grim Reaper movies. What's the definitive Grim Reaper movie?
Final Destination might be that, but
that
doesn't have the Grim Reaper image.
It doesn't have the Grim Reaper with the scythe. I want a definitive Grim Reaper monster movie.
90 minutes of the Grim Reaper killing people.
Exactly. Let's make a slasher movie, but have it be death.
That should be the name, Death. Like, let's not fuck around.
He thinks of creative ways to kill people, and he can summon buses with his mind.
Summon buses?
With his mind.
The difference between a horror fan and somebody who doesn't like horror. How willing are you to accept the inevitability that you're going to die someday? And I don't know if anybody's necessarily comfortable with it, except for maybe Shaolin monks on some fucking mountain somewhere. We all have to deal with that.
How does it have to be Shaolin monks, you racist?
Horror fans, maybe they're willing to communicate with that more, or at least with the concept in an abstract sense, because death is abstract to everybody until it happens to you.
For me, I'm really curious about what happens when you die. Horror movies allow us to explore that a little more.
Yeah, getting really personal on my behalf. My grandparents were Southern Baptist, very religious, so I had the idea of heaven and hell in my mind from a very young age. And I don't really believe in heaven and hell in a literal sense anymore. Oh, you do bad in your life, you go to a place where there's fire. You do good in your life, you go in a place where there's clouds and harps. I can't call myself an atheist, because the idea that when you die, nothing happens. You're there 1 minute and then you're gone. That creates some serious existential dread in me because I'm a narcissist, and the idea of me not existing terrifies me.
The first time that I ever actually realized it was here recently when my grandfather passed. I'm going to get really deep here, bear with me. That is the first time that I've ever noticed that there is a huge difference between a body with life in it and a lifeless body.
That's something that you really can't grasp until it's there in front of you.
I lived with my grandfather for so long, and then to see him lifeless, he looked like a completely different person. I didn't even recognize the body. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
When you get through it, when you see that, you realize that something, the human soul, exists. How can it not? How else could you explain that?
Those are questions that I don't have the answer to. The existence of the human soul. How do you even define a soul? Are we just neurons firing in our brains? Part of the reason why I feel so irrelevant towards major religion, I'm not trying to get too Tumblr here for you guys. The fact that anybody can go in front of people and speak with certainty about the existence of an afterlife, or...
I agree.
Nobody knows! Nobody really knows!
Right. To me, that was my proof.
I understand what you mean. Everybody remembers the first time they saw a dead body. It has a profound effect on everybody. Wow, okay, so let's...
yeah, that was really deep. Let's
just go back. Okay. Here's the next... Gee, holy shit. It could be like this every week, listeners. Here's the next topic I've got. What scares us?
Now clear your minds. It knows what scares you. It has from the very beginning. Don't give it any help. It knows too much already.
The psychological root of what a phobia is. Basically happens when something is there when somebody didn't expect it to be there. That's why spiders are such a common phobia, because spiders, those little fuckers, are real good at getting in tight places where they're not supposed to be. You can open up a pantry or a door and there's a spider there. When you're a child and you still don't really know how the world works, and you see that and it gives you a phobia of spiders for the rest of your fucking life.
Is there like a cadaverophobia? A zombieophobia?
Fear of dead bodies is a very, very common fear. People talk about the uncanny valley, and they talk about the uncanny valley in relation to things like dolls and mannequins. Freak people out. They freak me out a little bit. They look alive, but they're not. Corpse is the ultimate representation of the uncanny valley. It looks like it should be alive, but it's not. Dolls and mannequins are the inverse of that. They're never alive. And clowns fit in the same thing. I'm not afraid of clowns. You're not afraid of clowns. The entire generation of people born after us are fucking terrified of clowns. When clowns were conceived a long time ago, exaggeration of the feet and the nose and the face and the hair was meant to be comical, and it's a very fine line. Lon Chaney said, people laugh at a clown in the daylight, but if the same clown appeared at your door after midnight, what would your reaction be? What are the things that scared you as a kid?
It's so stupid. But there was this bush that was in my grandmother's yard. That bush used to terrify me. It's part of my fear of the unknown.
The two pillars the horror genre rests upon are fear of death and fear of the unknown, if they're not the same thing, which they may be.
I was always afraid that there was some kind of monster hiding in the bush. Or my grandmother has this thing where she likes to keep the shower curtain closed. I hate that.
You're afraid you're going to open up that shower curtain and something's going to be there?
Especially when I was a kid, I was more so terrified that the zombie that rips its head up off of his shoulder from Return of the Living Dead 3.
Okay, yeah, I know the one.
I know it's really specific, but I was terrified. That creature design scared the shit out of me.
That's so interesting.
And that specifically was the monster that I was afraid was hiding behind the bush.
Wow.
And I was always afraid that I was going to open up that curtain, find either him or Michelle from Subspecies hiding behind that curtain.
I wouldn't be too scared of Michelle, but...
More like dead body.
The thing with the bush, that's very similar. When I was a kid, my basement would not scare me, but I hated being in the basement after dark or by myself. There was just something about it that made me feel eerie. When I was a kid, because of the ventilation system, sometimes the door to our crawl space would open just a little bit. Here's another nightmare I used to have. I used to have nightmares about little creatures living in the crawl space and coming out at night. And I think that's why the movie Don't Be Afraid of the Dark got to a special place inside of me. But I was a timid kid. I was afraid of everything. My bedroom currently faces the hallway where there's another door open, and I cannot sleep if that door is open. The logical part of your brain that says, well, there's nothing in that room, doesn't function in the middle of the night when you're half asleep. Only the visceral, childlike nightmare part of your brain says, what if something peers out from behind that doorway? I can't sleep facing an open door. Imagine if your reaction, you wake up in the middle of the night, whatever the nearest door is open, there's something standing there, or a pair of eyes in there. You would shit your pants.
You know another thing that used to scare me?
What's that?
The movie itself didn't scare me, but there's one scene in the movie that, and you're going to laugh at me. Amityville Horror Part 2.
Okay.
The part where you see the dead family creeping up out of the ground scared the shit out of me.
There's a fantastic website. It's been one of my favorite websites going on a decade at this point, called kindertrauma.com. The mission statement of Kinder Trauma is to talk about the movies, TV shows, books, whatever that scared you as a kid. Everybody's got one. I think it's something that's limited to whatever you want to call the generation we're in. I talked to my mom about this. Her childhood fears were things like tornadoes and people breaking into her house and murdering her. Things that could actually happen when you're kids like us who were raised on pop culture. There's always something really specific that scared you as a child. I'll share one. I have a sister. I mentioned her before. She's 10 years older than me. She was a teenager when I was a little kid, and she was really into Stephen King and had a whole shelf full of Stephen King books. And one of those books was a paperback copy of Pet Sematary, and I will put the picture in the YouTube slideshow. This demonic-looking, terrible cat with this horrible mane of hair and these wild staring eyes, and this. She would chase me around the house with the cover to this book. I was terrified of it. Can look at it now.
You should have gone with the Tuber story. I think that would have been funny.
That's too embarrassing. I can't share it on the internet. It's sharing time, JD. Share another.
You know the Jason doll that I have?
Yeah. Those were the ones they sold at Spencer's, right?
Right.
Cloth dolls?
Right. When I was about 12 to 14, I used to feel like it was watching me. I couldn't be in the room unless he was facing the wall. And to this day, I will not have him facing out. He has to be in the back or facing a wall. I cannot have him facing out.
Totally get it, man.
He's a doll, and he's Jason.
Jason's never scared me.
Jason's never scared me either. That's why I don't get... I've always just said the doll is possessed. This one time, I had the dolls stacked up one on top of the other, flat against the wall to make more room. Plus, it was like one really wicked looking wall decoration. One day, all of these dolls fell, and the only one that hit me, I'm serious, the only one that hit me and was facing upwards was Jason.
Let's talk about dolls, because there's one for me. When I was a kid, the Child's Play franchise, specifically the character of Chucky, traumatized me. I remember one incident where I was reading a comic book. It was a Star Trek comic book, because yes, I've always been like this. Now, on the back cover was an advertisement for Child's Play 3, and I think that movie came out in 93, 92?
Something like that.
So that gives you a frame of reference for what age I would have been. That poster, if you remember it, is just Chucky's face. Big old face of him. And I remember seeing that comic book and tossing it behind the couch and just, I must have been 5 or 6 years old. That wasn't the beginning. Obviously, I had had some exposure to it before, because I was already scared of it. Something that is still scary to me to this day. Corrupted innocence. And let me clarify what I mean by that. I don't mean happiness, goodness being ruined and soiled by whatever. I mean the safety of childhood. What made Chucky so scary to me was I was a kid, I had a lot of toys and dolls and stuffed animals. The idea that something that was safe, being dangerous, frightened me on a very deep level. And I still have never seen those movies. Now let's talk about the things that scare us now.
Hands ghosting out of walls.
Why do you think that scares you?
I don't know. Can't explain it. Creepy. I don't know how to explain how it's creepy. It just is. Specifically that video on YouTube.
I think the name of the video is Real Demons Caught on Tape or something like that.
Yeah. Making the fucking shapes out of the hands.
When the door shuts, little baby hands come up underneath bottom of the door.
Oh.
It's something that's obviously not real. Some college student made this. I later found out that the guys who made that segment in VHS also made that video. We know it's not real. Still scares the shit out of you.
The scariest scene in VHS,
The last segment,
was the last segment with the fucking hands. And they're ghosting out walls and they're touching them on the face. Oh, God, it's creepy. You triggered me.
I'm sorry I triggered you, JD. And the internet has changed the way we're scared.
Oh, God, are you talking about Slender Man?
Yes, I'm going to talk about Slender Man. The internet has changed the rules 5 or 6 years ago when the Slender Man, the internet's boogeyman, started to enter the internet consciousness. It's practically mainstream at this point. For a while there, it was still kind of an underground thing. We know it's not real. We know the Slender Man doesn't exist. We can find the Something Awful thread on the message board where they invented the character. It's presented as if it's real. They call it an alternate reality game based around it being real. What scares me about the Slender Man is the violation of the safety of the fourth wall. The fourth wall that separates fiction and reality. The whole point of that character is that it violates that. It's like pro wrestling. Everybody just pretends it's real.
That's like the kids with big black eyes.
Oh, the black-eyed children? That's another kind of
creepy knocking
creepypasta.
on the door.
Yeah, it's another creepypasta, urban legend kind of thing.
And it's been more of a thing here recently than when I was a child. It really did start back when I was in 11th grade. It was a local thing.
A girl we went to school with, there was a home invasion and she was killed.
The night that I found out she was murdered, I was watching Urban Legend.
Oh, great. We'll be talking about that movie soon, too.
The scene where the guy with the hatchet comes up out of the backseat.
Everybody, when they get into their car at night, looks in the backseat. At least we do. What if somebody's in the backseat?
I have seen enough horror movies to know you check that fucking backseat. And now it's zombies and hands ghosting out of walls. I am terrified that the world is going to end in a zombie apocalypse because in my brain, that's how the world's going to end. I know, I'm stupid.
Zombies aren't real.
They could be. Aliens.
Aliens might be real, but they've never found us.
They might find us. That's why it would be the end of the world, Zach, when they find us and when they come down to steal our water, they're going to kill us.
Something else I want to discuss about Slender Man. Going back to the Uncanny Valley, the character has no face. There's nothing for us to relate to.
Oh, that's another thing. Faceless Santas.
Faceless Santas?
Yeah, I know it's specific. But Target last year for Christmas had this signing up that was Santa, but you never saw his face.
That's what the entire slasher movie mask plays on. The hockey mask and the Michael Myers mask.
Yeah, but those don't scare me because there's still a face.
Yeah, there's a face underneath of it. You read about how the brain works. When you look at something, you're meant to see 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. And when something disrupts that, it's very, very disturbing.
I even asked my store manager, you mean to tell me that this is supposed to be less traumatizing to kids than Santa Claus is white or black or whatever color?
I've got a creepy Santa story, too. There was a brief period of time when I would spend the night with my grandmother. Wonderful old woman. This is not the religious, crazy grandparents. My grandmother collected Santa Clauses. The room I slept in had one of those Santas that are mechanical and turn a switch and it has a candle and he slowly sways. And that was in the room with me at night. And I remember remember falling asleep watching that fucker. I'm waiting for you to do something creepy, man. So what are some movies in recent memory that gave you that thrill? That thrill that every horror fan's looking for?
Well, most recently, It Follows.
Yeah, just this year. That was a good one.
I just watched that movie again.
Something that it does that is so clever. It's slowly approaching. Somebody walking towards you slowly but determined.
Did you remember what it is? Did you notice that the big tall guy comes into the room
out of the hallway?
Friend? Did you notice that his eyes were gouged out and he was bleeding?
Yeah, I did notice that.
I didn't notice that before.
Yeah.
I made Kayla watch it for the first time, and when he come in like that, she jumped back. She said, "What the fuck?"
The director tapped into something sort of fresh and new and exciting, and that's why that's one of the most exciting horror films that we've seen. Certainly this year and in a while, too.
Plays with the aspect of be careful who you have sex with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a resonance to it.
Successful horror movies, I feel, have some sense of morality to them.
I come from the George Romero school of horror, where every horror should have some sort of real-world resonance. Speaking of eyeless things, I don't want to talk about this too much, though, because it's spoiler. Lucky McKee's movie, The Woman, the sequence at the end of The Woman, character makes a very sudden appearance, and there's something very disturbing about the way this character looks. It hit me somewhere. And if you haven't seen The Woman, see it. It's a phenomenal film. When you think of the horror films that have scared you over the years, what comes to mind?
For the longest time, I couldn't watch the original Night of the Living Dead because the black and white made it scary.
Well, the thing that still astonishes me about Night of the Living Dead, and I probably said this when we talked about those movies last September, it feels like a newsreel. How intentional it was is up to debate. Night of the Living Dead, it feels like a newsreel. It feels like it could happen. Speaking of end-of-the-world scenarios, nuclear annihilation, there's a movie called The War Game, and it's only a 40-minute film. It's a British film, and it was made in the 60s. Pseudo-documentary about what would happen if a nuclear bomb fell on Britain. The recreations of nuclear annihilation world and the collapse of society are very chilling. It feels like it could happen. And there are horror films out there like Last House on the Left or Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. They feel like snuff movies. They feel forbidden in a very real sense.
The 70s version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that scared me.
At the end when Donald Sutherland points and goes, nah!
That was always my favorite part of the movie, still is. You feel the fatigue.
Nobody can sleep.
You feel like you're right there with them, you can't sleep. Oh my god, they're always on the run.
Well, that's why in the original Kevin McCarthy is crazy by the end of the movie. Why they keep remaking Invasion of the Body Snatchers is because that central premise that there's something coming and it's going to rob you of your individuality, the thing that you use to define yourself as a person. And it's going to happen when you're sleeping, something everybody has to do. One of the most brilliant horror movie premises, and I don't care what you say, JD, Invasion of the Body Snatcher, it's a horror film. You're not going to argue that one with me?
No, why would I argue that with you?
Oh, because they're aliens, JD.
Yeah, but it's different, Zach. Ooh, hold on, one more.
You got one.
Salem's Lot.
You've mentioned this before.
That is probably one of the scariest, if not the scariest, vampire movie.
That's interesting to me because I've never liked that original Salem's Lot.
You gotta remember, I saw Salem's Lot as a kid. To this day, it still creeps me out. Kid comes and pecks on the window.
Yeah, this has come up many times before.
Look at me, teacher.
I saw Salem's Lot as a teenager, and I thought it was incredibly hokey. But obviously, you saw it as a kid, and it had a profound effect on you.
I think that's why some things will make me jump more than they'll make you jump, because a lot of the shit I saw as a kid, you know? And I guess the horror movies have fucked me up more than I thought they had.
I was a really timid child, which is why I didn't get into horror until I was older. And I can look back on it now and say, well, I was timid, but I was also fascinated by it. My interest in horror evolved out of I was just really easily spooked as a child. See if anybody listening can identify this.
My cousin saw this movie as a kid, and she's been talking about this movie for years. I tried to help her find it. I even got my good old buddy, Mr. Bangers, on
Resident horror expert.
Man, if I haven't heard of this movie, surely he has. And even he hasn't heard of it. It's some movie where a little boy gives his little sister a rabbit's foot to protect her from some kind of evil creatures, and she said there's a lake or a pond where creatures reach their hands up out of to grab a hold of the kids.
I googled horror movie Rabbit's Foot. What Wikipedia came up with was a film called The Cellar, which I've seen. The main character in that movie is a young boy. There's definitely a scene of it in a lake, but I don't remember anything in The Cellar about a rabbit's foot.
It's a movie from the 80s?
The Cellar was like late 80s, I think.
Yeah, we'll have to watch it and see if that's the one.
I know what you want. You want to see the movie.
Something happens when you point the camera at something terrible.
Before we finish, let's just ask one more question. It's the last question in my notes here. Why do we like being scared?
The adrenaline rush.
Is that it? Ooh, makes your heart beat a little faster?
When I get scared, I feel more alive. Clearly, my favorite subgenre is slasher.
You tend to go back to that. My favorite horror subgenre, I want to say monster movie, which can cover anything.
I don't know, there's just something freeing about it.
Why do I like being scared? Because it speaks to something inside of me, and what that something is, I don't really know. Maybe I'm still trying to figure out the nature of being afraid. We're always looking for a good scare. We're always looking for a good jump.
I think another reason why we might like being scared, and I've I've kind of hit on it before, that it helps us discover more about ourselves.
Exactly.
Fear is such a strong emotion, and it brings stuff out.
And that's what fear and horror is about. The part of our brain that gets scared by things isn't logical. It speaks on something more visceral, something more human. This shit got deep, man. Whew, give us a Peabody.
Yeah, and give us an award, too.
This has been a very introspective episode of the Bangers and Mash Show. If you have any childhood fears, talking about things that scare you, feel free to email us at bangersandmash88@yahoo.com. That's the word bangers, letter N, word mash88@yahoo.com. Thank you, Seriad, for the very nice image you left on the Facebook group. You may find that Facebook group at www.facebook.com/The Bangers and Mash Show. As JD said, stay scared because it helps you discover more about yourself. And come back again next time for more hot Bangers and Mash.
Sometimes when you're scared to take a look at the corner of the room, sense that something's within you. Fear of the dark, fear of the dark. I have a constant fear that something's always there. Fear of the dark, fear of the dark. I have a phobia that someone's always there. Never been alone at night. Thought you knew steps ahead. Turn around, no one's there. And there's some quick kind of the face. Find it hard to look again, because you're sure there's someone